December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. A German Panther tank commander scans the snow-covered landscape through his periscope. His crew is exhausted, cold, hungry, but they're veterans of the Eastern Front. They've faced Soviet T-34s and lived to tell about it. When he spots an American vehicle moving across the ridgeline, he allows himself a slight smile. Easy kill. He gives the order. The gunner adjusts. They fire. The shell screams toward the target and misses. Before his loader can slam another round into the breech, the American vehicle has already moved 200 yards. The commander's smile vanishes. He's never seen anything move that fast. He orders his driver to pivot the tank, trying to bring the main gun to bear. But the American is already circling, impossibly fast, like a shark in water. By the time the Panther's turret completes its traverse, there's a flash from the American's gun. The shell punches through the Panther's thinner rear armor. The German commander's last thought is disbelief. He never saw it coming. The Germans would come to call it der Rennwagen, the race car. The Americans called it the Hellcat, and it was about to rewrite everything the world thought it knew about armored warfare. But to understand how the Hellcat came to terrorize German tank crews, we need to go back 2 years earlier to 1942, when American armor was dying in North Africa. The first time American Sherman tanks faced German armor in significant numbers was a massacre. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, February 1943, American forces were routed. German Panzer divisions, led by Rommel himself, tore through American positions like they weren't even there. Sherman after Sherman exploded. Crews burned alive. The few who managed to bail out watched helplessly as their tanks became coffins for their friends. The Sherman's 75mm gun bounced off German armor at any reasonable range. Meanwhile, German 88mm guns could penetrate a Sherman from over a mile away. The math was simple and brutal. German gunners could kill American tanks long before the Americans could even fight back. The reports that came back to Washington were devastating. Tank crews were calling Shermans Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up on the first strike. Another nickname was even worse, Tommy Cookers. For every German Panzer destroyed in North Africa and later in Italy, the Allies were losing 4 or 5 Shermans. The casualty rates for American tank crews were approaching those of bomber crews. Families were receiving telegrams. Mothers were burying sons who'd been burned beyond recognition. Military planners knew they had a crisis. The Sherman had been designed in 1940 and 1941, when the German tanks they expected to face were much lighter. By 1943, the Germans had the Panther with sloped armor that could deflect most Allied shots, and the Tiger, an absolute monster with armor so thick that only a direct hit at close range had any chance of penetration. American doctrine said that tanks should fight infantry and other soft targets, while specialized tank destroyers would handle enemy armor. But the tank destroyers they had, like the M10 Wolverine, were based on the Sherman chassis. They had slightly better guns but were almost as slow, maxing out at maybe 30 miles per hour on a good road. The problem wasn't just technological. It was philosophical. The M10 Wolverine weighed 30 tons. It had decent armor, decent firepower, but it couldn't maneuver. When German tanks appeared, the M10S would try to get into position, but by the time they arrived, the Panthers and Tigers had either destroyed their targets or repositioned. Tank warfare in Europe wasn't like the open deserts of North Africa. It was hedgerows in France, forests in Belgium, ruined cities in Germany. You needed to move fast, hit hard, and disappear before the enemy could coordinate a response. General Andrew Bruce, who commanded the Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood in Texas, understood this. He'd been studying reports from the front lines obsessively. He'd read accounts from tank destroyer crews who arrived at battle positions 5 minutes too late and watched helplessly as German armor withdrew. He'd read after-action reports where M10 commanders called for fire support, only to have German tanks reposition while they were waiting. Bruce became convinced that the current doctrine was wrong. Armor and firepower didn't matter if you couldn't get to the fight in time. He started pushing for a radical new design. Strip away the armor. Strip away everything that added weight. Build something that could get to the battlefield faster than anything the Germans had. Build something that could choose when and where to fight. His superiors thought he was crazy. 1 inch of armor? Tank crews would be sitting ducks. But Bruce countered with a question. What good is thick armor if you're always too slow to use it effectively? The contract went to Buick of all companies. Not a traditional military contractor, but an American car manufacturer that understood speed and engines. The design team looked at the requirements and realized they were essentially being asked to build a race car that could kill tanks. The prototype designation was T-70. It would eventually become the M18. The engineers at Buick made choices that seemed insane to traditional tank designers. The hull armor maxed out at 1 inch. 1 inch. For comparison, a Sherman had over 2 inches on the front, and a Panther had nearly 5 inches of sloped armor. The M18's armor could be penetrated by German anti-tank rifles, let alone tank guns. The turret was open-topped, meaning the crew was partially exposed to artillery and small arms fire. Every conventional military mind said this was suicide. But then came the engine. A 9-cylinder radial aircraft engine, modified for ground use, pushing 450 horsepower. The entire vehicle weighed only 18 tons, less than a third of a Tiger tank. The power-to-weight ratio was insane, over 25 horsepower per ton. For context, a Sherman had about 11 horsepower per ton. A Panther had about 13. The M18 could accelerate from a standstill to 30 miles per hour in less than 20 seconds. Its top speed on roads was 55 miles per hour. Some crews claimed they'd pushed it to 60 miles per hour in a tracked vehicle. In 1943, the main gun was a 76mm M1A2, the same gun that would later be mounted on upgraded Shermans. It could penetrate most German armor from the side or rear, and the Hellcat's speed meant it could always position for those shots. The gun could traverse 360 degrees, and the turret could spin completely around in under 20 seconds. Combined with the vehicle's speed, this meant a Hellcat could see a target, fire, and be repositioning before most German tanks could even turn their turrets to face the threat. When the first M18S rolled off the production line in July 1943, reaction from the armored community was mixed. Tank destroyer crews who'd been driving M10S looked at the thin armor and open top and shook their heads. Some refused to crew them initially. It looked like a death trap. But others, especially younger crews, saw something different. They saw possibility. They saw a vehicle that wouldn't just lumber into battle, but could dance around it. The doctrine that developed was called shoot and scoot, though the crews had cruder names for it. The idea was simple but required nerves of steel. You'd position in cover, preferably in terrain that allowed multiple escape routes. You'd wait for German armor to move into your kill zone. You'd fire, aiming for side or rear armor where your 76mm gun could penetrate. And then, before the Germans could coordinate a response, you'd already be gone, racing to your next firing position half a mile away or more. The first M18S reached Italy in mid-1944, assigned to the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Their first major engagement was near Rome. A German armored column was moving through a narrow valley, trying to retreat from advancing Allied infantry. The Hellcats set up on the ridgeline. When the signal came, 3 M18s opened fire simultaneously. The lead German tank exploded. The second took a round through the engine compartment. Panic spread through the German column. Their commander tried to organize a response, ordering his tanks to return fire at the ridgeline. But by the time they'd aimed and fired, the Hellcats were already gone, having reversed down the rear slope of the ridge. The Germans sent infantry to investigate. They found empty firing positions and track marks leading in 3 different directions. 6 minutes after the first shot, the 3 Hellcats had repositioned to a different ridgeline, nearly a mile away. They opened fire again. 2 more German tanks destroyed. The German commander, believing he was facing a much larger force positioned on multiple ridgelines, ordered a full retreat. His remaining tanks tried to race through the valley. The Hellcats pursued, firing on the move. By the end of the engagement, 7 German tanks and assault guns had been destroyed. The Hellcats hadn't taken a single hit. When the crews returned to base, their commanders didn't believe the after-action reports. It seemed impossible, but it kept happening. M18 units in Italy started racking up kills at rates that seemed fantastical. A single Hellcat would engage a German position, destroy one or two vehicles, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. German situation reports from Italy in late 1944 start mentioning high-speed American tank destroyers and warning commanders to expect rapid repositioning and multiple attack angles. Some reports advised that when a Hellcat was spotted, commanders should assume there were others nearby and prepare for attacks from unexpected directions. The psychological warfare was almost as effective as the actual kills. German tank crews started seeing Hellcats everywhere. Every muzzle flash could be a Hellcat. Every movement in the tree line. The speed of the vehicle created a reputation that exceeded even its actual capabilities. One captured German tanker, when interrogated, claimed that Hellcats could teleport between positions. What he'd actually experienced was a single M18 that had fired from one location, raced at top speed to another position nearly a mile away, and fired again, all in under 3 minutes. To the German crew, it seemed like two different vehicles, or like the same vehicle had somehow moved impossibly fast. Then came December 1944, and everything changed. Hitler launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge. It was Germany's last major offensive of the war, a desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by hundreds of Panzers, Panthers, and Tigers, smashed through the thinly defended Ardennes forest. The weather was miserable, fog and snow preventing Allied air support. American units were scattered, many of them green troops who'd never seen combat. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcats, was positioned near the town of Bastogne when the German offensive began. Within hours, they were surrounded by German armor. The situation was desperate. American forces were outnumbered and cut off. The Germans had momentum, surprise, and overwhelming firepower. But they didn't have speed. The Hellcats of the 704th began moving, not retreating, hunting. Small teams of 1 or 2 M18s would race through the snowy landscape, appearing at German flanks, firing, and disappearing into the blizzard. The weather that grounded Allied planes worked in the Hellcats' favor too. German tank commanders couldn't get clear sight lines, couldn't coordinate properly. By the time they spotted a Hellcat and trained their guns on it, it was already gone, just tracks in the snow leading off in some random direction. Near the village of Beth, a single M18 Hellcat crew, led by Sergeant Henry Thompson, spotted a German column moving along a forest road. 5 Panther tanks, infantry following behind, confident in their superiority. Standard doctrine would have been to report the position and withdraw, letting artillery or aircraft handle it. But there were no artillery batteries in range, and no aircraft could fly in this weather. Thompson made a decision. They'd engage. They positioned on a small hill overlooking the road, partially concealed by trees. Thompson gave the order. They fired. The lead Panther took a 76mm shell to its side armor, below the turret ring. It ground to a halt, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. Before the German crews could react, Thompson's driver was already reversing, backing down the hill. The Germans fired at where the Hellcat had been, shells exploding in empty snow. Thompson's Hellcat raced along the tree line, nearly 400 yards, and stopped in a new position. 30 seconds had passed since their first shot. They fired again. The second Panther in line exploded, its ammunition cooking off. Now the German commander knew he was in trouble. He couldn't see his enemy, couldn't predict where the next shot would come from. He made a tactical decision that would prove fatal. He ordered his remaining 3 Panthers to spread out and search for the attacker. It was exactly what Thompson had hoped for. Divided, the Panthers were vulnerable. The Hellcat's speed meant it could engage each tank individually before the others could provide support. Over the next 40 minutes, in a deadly game of cat and mouse through the frozen forest, Thompson's single Hellcat picked off the remaining 3 Panthers one by one. Each time the pattern was the same. Fire, move, reposition, fire again. The Germans never got a clean shot. They fired at ghosts, at muzzle flashes, at positions that were already empty. When American reinforcements finally reached Beth several hours later, they found 5 destroyed Panther tanks scattered along 2 miles of forest road. They found Thompson's Hellcat, its gun barrel still hot enough that snow melted when it touched the metal. Thompson and his crew were sitting on the hull, smoking cigarettes, looking like they'd just finished a routine patrol. When asked what happened, Thompson shrugged and said, "We kept moving. This wasn't an isolated incident." All across the Bulge, Hellcat crews were engaging German armor with tactics that seemed to defy logic. A crew from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged a Tiger tank, the most feared German vehicle of the war, near the town of Mannheim. The Tiger had 8 inches of frontal armor. The Hellcat's 76mm gun couldn't penetrate it from the front, not at any range. But the crew didn't attack from the front. They circled at top speed, forcing the Tiger to try to rotate its turret to track them. But the Tiger's turret traverse was slow, and the Hellcat was fast. They stayed in the Tiger's blind spot, circling like a shark, until they had a clean shot at the rear armor. One shot, the Tiger burned. German situation reports from the Bulge start to show real panic about the Hellcats. One report, sent from a Panzer Division headquarters to Army Group B, warned, "American high-speed tank destroyers are causing disproportionate losses. Conventional engagement tactics are ineffective. Units are advised to maintain tight formations and avoid exposing flanks under any circumstances." Another report, from a battalion commander, stated bluntly, "We cannot catch them. We cannot predict them. We can only hope they engage someone else." But here's the thing that doesn't show up in the official histories. Hellcat crews were terrified. That thin armor meant that any hit was probably fatal. There were no minor wounds in a Hellcat. If an 88mm shell hit you, you were dead. The crews knew this every single time they went out. One Hellcat commander, in a letter home that was later published, wrote, "Every engagement is a gamble. We're betting that we're faster and smarter than they are. Most days we win that bet. But every day, I wonder if today's the day we lose." The casualty rates tell the story. While Hellcats had incredible kill ratios, they were also lost in combat. 216 minutes and 18 seconds were lost in Europe alone. Each one represented a crew of 5 men. Many of them burned to death because that thin armor provided no protection. Some crews were killed by artillery or mortar fire because of the open-top turret. Others were ambushed by German tanks that managed to get the first shot off. The speed that made the Hellcat so deadly also attracted aggressive commanders who took risks that other tank destroyer crews wouldn't. The line between bravery and recklessness was razor thin. But the kills kept mounting. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge in January 1945, Hellcat battalions had collectively claimed hundreds of German armored vehicles. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion alone claimed over 200 kills throughout the entire war. The 705th claimed similar numbers. Individual crews became legends. One Hellcat, nicknamed Bat Outta Hell, was credited with 17 confirmed kills. Another, Canned Heat, claimed 23. As the Allies pushed into Germany itself in early 1945, the Hellcat's role evolved. In the open fields of France and Belgium, speed had been the ultimate advantage. In the ruined cities of Germany, things were different. Urban combat favored ambush tactics and short engagement ranges. German Panzerfaust teams could hide in rubble and destroy any vehicle, fast or slow. The Hellcat's thin armor became an even bigger liability. But Hellcat crews adapted. They started working more closely with infantry, using the infantry to clear buildings while the M18s covered streets and intersections. They used their speed to race from one defensive position to another, never staying in one place long enough for German anti-tank teams to set up. In the battle for Cologne, Hellcats raced through city streets at speeds that seemed suicidal, firing on the move at German strong points, drawing fire away from advancing American infantry. One engagement in March 1945, in the city of Remagen, shows how far the Hellcat's reputation had spread. A German Panther was dug into a defensive position near the famous bridge. American forces needed the bridge intact. Sherman tanks tried to advance but were driven back by the Panther's accurate fire. A Hellcat was called up. The crew surveyed the situation, then did something nobody expected. They drove at full speed, directly at the Panther, zigzagging to avoid fire. The German crew, surprised by the aggressive tactics, fired and missed. The Hellcat got to point-blank range, less than 50 yards, and fired directly into the Panther's gun mantlet, the one weak point in its frontal armor. The Panther's main gun was destroyed, the crew bailed out, and American infantry secured the bridge. The psychological impact on German forces by this point in the war was profound. Captured German tankers interrogated in early 1945 consistently mentioned American race car tanks as one of their primary concerns. One Tiger tank commander, captured near the Rhine, when asked what weapon he feared most, didn't say Allied aircraft or artillery. He said, "The Hellcat. You never know where it is. You never know when it will appear. And when it does appear, you have maybe 10 seconds to kill it before it kills you or disappears. I have seen Panthers destroyed by Hellcats that we never even saw. Just the shot and the explosion and nothing. Ghosts." By the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, over 2,500 M18 Hellcats had been produced. They'd served in every major campaign from Italy to Germany. The official records credit them with 526 confirmed kills of German tanks and assault guns, though the real number was almost certainly higher because of the chaos of combat and the difficulty of confirming kills when you were racing away from the engagement. The loss ratio was remarkable. 526 German vehicles destroyed versus 216 minutes and 18 seconds lost in combat. That's nearly 2.5 to 1, one of the best ratios of any Allied armored vehicle in the European theater. But numbers don't tell the full story. The Hellcat proved something that military theorists had debated for decades. In armored warfare, mobility could be more important than protection. The Germans had built the Tigers and Panthers like medieval castles, prioritizing armor and firepower. The Americans, with the Hellcat, had built a rapier instead of a broadsword. Both approaches could work, but the Hellcat showed that speed and tactics could overcome raw power. After the war, the M18 was quickly phased out. The Army decided that tank destroyers as a separate branch weren't needed anymore, that regular tanks should handle anti-tank duties. Many Hellcats were sold to other nations or scrapped. A few ended up in museums. Today, you can see restored M18s at places like the National Armor and Cavalry Museum in Georgia or the Military Vehicle Technology Foundation in California. They sit silent, preserved, their racing days long over. But for the crews who drove them in combat, the Hellcat represented something more than just a vehicle. It represented a philosophy, that courage and speed and smart tactics could overcome superior firepower. That sometimes the best armor isn't steel, it's never being where the enemy thinks you are. That in war, the scariest opponent isn't always the strongest one. It's the one you never see coming. The veterans, in their later years, would gather at reunions. They'd swap stories about racing through Belgian forests at 50 miles per hour, about ambushing Panthers, about that feeling when you fired and then floored the accelerator, knowing you had maybe 15 seconds to get to cover before German shells started landing. They'd remember friends who didn't make it, crews who took that one unlucky hit, who learned too late that speed wasn't always enough. But they'd also remember the victories, the impossible kills, the times when everything worked perfectly, when the speed and the gun and the tactics all came together, and they destroyed enemy armor that outweighed them by 30 tons. They'd remember feeling invincible, even though they knew they weren't. They'd remember being hunters, not prey. The Germans expected their panzers to dominate the battlefields of Europe. They'd built the biggest, heaviest, most powerful tanks the world had ever seen. They'd refined their tactics on the Eastern Front, destroying thousands of Soviet tanks. They thought armor and firepower would win the war. The Hellcat had other plans. Proved that in war, sometimes the best weapon isn't the biggest or the strongest. Sometimes it's the fastest. Sometimes it's the one that makes the enemy afraid, not because of what it can take, but because of what it can do before you even know it's there. 60 miles per hour, 1 inch of armor, 526 German tanks destroyed. The M18 Hellcat didn't just hunt German armor. It changed the rules of how armor was hunted. And for a few brutal years in the 1940s, it was the fastest, deadliest predator on the European battlefield.